The photograph measures 8 inches by 10, mounted on cream cardboard that has yellowed to the color of old bone. 3 young black women stand shoulder to shoulder beside an ornate mahogany chair, their faces so alike that the eye struggles to distinguish one from another. Same high cheekbones, same steady gaze, same dark hair parted precisely down the center and pulled into identical low buns. Their dresses match too, simple gray cotton with white collars, probably their Sunday best. The composition is perfect, symmetrical, controlled. But their hands tell a different story. The sister on the left clasps her right wrist with her left hand, 2 fingers extended. The middle sister grips her own wrist with 3 fingers showing. The right sister holds 4 fingers visible against her forearm. The photograph was taken in Charleston, South Carolina, in August of 1863, and on the back, in fading ink, someone wrote, "The triplet maids, together 1 week only." For a century and a half, that image sat in a cardboard box in a family attic, hiding a secret written in plain sight. The intern's name was Maya Chen, and she had been digitizing photographs in the basement of the Low Country Heritage Museum for 6 weeks when she found the triplets. The museum occupied a renovated cotton warehouse on East Bay Street in Charleston, its brick walls 2 feet thick, its windows narrow as rifle slits. The digitization project had been funded by a state grant to preserve private collections before they decomposed completely, and Maya's job was simple: scan, catalog, and tag every image for the database. The Whitfield family had donated 14 boxes of photographs, letters, and documents that spring. Cornelius Whitfield IV had died at 92, and his granddaughter wanted the historical materials preserved somewhere they might actually matter. Most of what Maya found was predictable: daguerreotypes of stern patriarchs, tintypes of children in stiff Sunday clothes, fading snapshots of weddings and military send-offs. Nothing that would stop a researcher's breath. Until she opened Box 7 on a Thursday afternoon in late June, 2019. The photograph was tucked between 2 images of the Whitfield family's summer house on Sullivan's Island. Maya almost missed it. She lifted it into the light of her scanning lamp, and 3 identical faces looked back at her with expressions that seemed to hold something between patience and calculation. The technical quality was excellent for 1863, a professional studio portrait, judging by the painted backdrop and the posed formality. But something about the composition felt wrong. Not the faces. Those were serene, controlled, almost mask-like in their similarity. The hands, though. Maya set the photograph down and pulled out her magnifying glass. The fingers weren't random. Each sister displayed a deliberate count. 2, 3, 4. Not a natural way to hold your own wrist during a formal sitting. Maya flipped the photograph over and read the notation again. The triplet maids, together 1 week only. 1 week. Why specify that? Why photograph them at all if they were enslaved domestic workers passing through? She photographed the image with her phone and sent it to Dr. Patricia Hale, the museum's director of collections. The reply came back in 4 minutes. "Don't touch anything else in that box, I'm coming down." Patricia Hale was 63 years old and had spent 4 decades studying the documentary evidence of enslavement in the Low Country. She wore reading glasses on a silver chain and carried a leather notebook wherever she went, its pages filled with cross-referenced names and dates that most historians had forgotten or never known. When she arrived in the basement archive, she was already wearing the white cotton gloves she used for handling fragile documents. "Show me," she said. Maya laid the photograph on the scanning table. Patricia studied it in silence for nearly a minute. then reached for the magnifying glass. Her eyes moved from face to hands, hands to faces, then to the notation on the back. "Have you looked at the rest of the box?" "Not yet. I was waiting for you." Together, they emptied box 7 onto the work table. 32 photographs, 17 letters, a thin leather account book with marbled end papers, and a folded document that turned out to be a hiring agreement dated July 15, 1863, signed by Cornelius Whitfield I. The account book was what Patricia wanted. She opened it carefully, supporting the spine with one hand while turning pages with the other. The handwriting was crabbed and irregular, entries recorded in brown ink that had faded to rust. Most of the pages documented household expenditures, payments for lamp oil, imported tea, silk fabric, a silver tea service. But starting in 1859, a different set of entries appeared. Hired out Delia to Mrs. Havisham, King Street residence, $18 per month. Below that, hired out Dinah to Collier Marchant, Beaufort property, $16 per month. And 3 lines down, hired out Delphine to Reverend Caldwell, Somerville Parish, $20 per month. Patricia ran her finger down the page. 3 names starting with D. Delia, Dinah, Delphine. Monthly hire payments from different households, different locations. Look at the dates. Maya leaned in. The entries ran for years. 1859, 1860, 1861, 1862. The women were never hired to the same place at the same time. Delia went to Charleston addresses, Dinah to Beaufort plantations, Delphine to parishes in the interior counties. And every few months, the names rotated to different employers, never overlapping. They were being moved around deliberately, Maya said. Exactly. And in August 1863, all 3 contracts terminated on the same date. Patricia flipped forward. The final entries showed a lump payment of $200 from something called the Coastal Relief Association, and a note in different handwriting. Services concluded, all 3 returned, photograph commissioned per association request. Maya picked up one of the letters from the box. The paper was so thin it was almost translucent, the fold lines worn soft as cloth. The letter was addressed to Cornelius Whitfield from someone named Randolph Havisham, dated April 9th, 1863. Sir, regarding your inquiry about the triplet arrangement, I must express again my complete satisfaction with Delia's service. She is punctual, discreet, and has given my wife no cause for complaint. The substitution you propose, temporarily replacing Delia with Dinah while Delia attends to your niece's household, seems unnecessary, as my wife has grown accustomed to Delia's particular manner. However, if you insist the exchange is essential for reasons you cannot disclose, I will comply, provided the substitution occurs during my absence in Columbia on business the 3rd week of April. Patricia set down her notebook. He's talking about switching them, Delia for Dinah, and the employer wouldn't even notice because they looked identical. That's not possible, Maya said. Nobody could maintain that kind of deception. Different employers would catch on. Unless the employers were in on it. Or unless the triplets were extraordinarily skilled at mimicking each other's mannerisms and speech patterns. Or... Patricia paused, picking up the photograph again. Or unless the whole point wasn't deception at all. What if it was communication? The hands? 2, 3, 4? Not random. A code. Patricia photographed every document in box 7 using the museum's high-resolution camera, then locked the originals in the climate-controlled vault on the 2nd floor. She told Maya to continue with the other Whitfield boxes, but to flag anything else that mentioned the triplets or the Coastal Relief Association. Over the next week, Maya found 3 more references. A letter from a Charleston attorney discussing the unusual hiring arrangement necessitated by the triplets' unique circumstances. An invoice for 3 matching dresses, delivered to the Whitfield residence in July 1863. And a newspaper clipping from the Charleston Mercury, dated August 23, 1863, announcing a fundraising drive for widow and orphan relief organized by the Coastal Relief Association. Patricia spent those same 7 days in the museum's research library, cross-referencing names and addresses. She discovered that Randolph Haversham, who had hired Delia, was a cotton factor who did business with plantation owners across the Low Country. Colonel Marchant, who had hired Dinah, was a militia commander who traveled frequently between Beaufort and Charleston. Reverend Caldwell, who had hired Delphine, served a circuit of rural parishes and visited dozens of plantations each month as part of his ministry. 3 women, 3 separate circuits, 3 different networks of movement and access. On the 8th day, Patricia called Maya into her office and closed the door. "I'm taking this material to the South Carolina Historical Society," Patricia said. "They have better resources for this kind of investigation, and I'm not publishing anything about it until we know what we're looking at." "Why not?" Patricia removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Because if these women were doing what I think they were doing, moving information between enslaved families, coordinating activities across multiple properties, then documenting it publicly could expose descendants to scrutiny they haven't asked for. There are people alive today whose great-great-grandparents might have relied on whatever network the triplets were running." "But that's incredible," Maya said. "That's resistance. That's agency. That's exactly the kind of story that needs to be told. It's also dangerous, even now." Patricia opened her desk drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were 3 pages she'd printed that morning. Genealogical records showing that a woman named Delia Whitfield had married a freedman named Samuel Rivers in Charleston in 1866. They'd had 4 children. One of those children, a daughter named Grace, had moved to Philadelphia during the Great Migration and raised 6 children of her own. "Grace Rivers' youngest son is still alive," Patricia said quietly. "He's 87 years old, and he lives in Mount Pleasant, 20 minutes from here. Before I tell the world that his great-grandmother was part of an underground information network during the Civil War, I'm going to ask him what he knows and what he wants made public." Maya understood. History wasn't abstract. It had weight, and that weight fell on living people who had no say in which ancestors' stories got excavated for public consumption. Patricia locked the folder back in her drawer. "In the meantime, we research carefully, we document thoroughly, and we don't make assumptions about what those hand positions mean until we have evidence." But they both knew what the hands looked like. Counting, signaling, marking routes on an invisible map. Charleston in 1859 smelled like salt marsh, horse manure, and money. The city's wealth rested on a foundation of enslaved labor, 40,000 black people bound by law and violence, working the rice plantations that stretched inland from the coast, the cotton fields that produced millions of pounds of fiber annually, the docks where ships loaded cargo bound for Liverpool and New York. In the city itself, enslaved people worked as domestics, craftsmen, draymen, fishermen, and every other occupation the white population needed but refused to perform themselves. Cornelius Whitfield owned 32 people in 1859. Most worked on his rice plantation on the Ashley River, 20 miles northwest of Charleston. But 11 lived and worked in his townhouse on Meeting Street. a three-story brick structure with wrought iron balconies and a kitchen building out back. The Whitfield household operated like a small factory. Laundry, cooking, cleaning, child-minding, serving at table, maintaining the gardens, driving the carriage. Delia, Dinah, and Delphine had been born into that household in April of 1841, delivered by the same midwife within an hour of each other. Their mother, an enslaved woman named Patience, died 3 days later from fever. The babies survived, nursed by 2 other women in the household, and grew into nearly identical girls who learned quickly that their similarity could be useful. At age 7, they started swapping places during lessons with the Whitfield children's tutor, who never noticed that Delia one day seemed to struggle with French verbs she'd mastered the previous week. At 10, they traded off kitchen duties, confusing the cook until she started marking their aprons with different colored thread. By 15, they'd developed a private language of gestures and expressions that let them communicate across a crowded room without speaking. Cornelius Whitfield noticed, and in 1858, when his widowed sister in Savannah asked him to lend her a maid for 6 months, he had an idea. What if he hired out all 3 girls separately to different households across the region? The income would be useful. Enslaved domestics could be hired out for $15 to $25 per month, depending on their skills. But more valuable than the money was the access. 3 identical women, each embedded in a different household, each traveling a different circuit, each able to impersonate the others if needed. They could gather information, deliver messages, and move between properties without raising suspicion, because who would question a hired servant going about her mistress's business? Whitfield didn't intend to help enslaved people communicate. His plan was purely commercial and social. He wanted intelligence about which plantations were profitable, which families were in financial trouble, which cotton factors were trustworthy. He wanted his servants to overhear conversations at dinner tables, to note which households were buying or selling people, to report back on the private affairs of Charleston's elite. What he didn't anticipate was that Delia, Dinah, and Delphine would build their own network. Delia arrived at the Haversham residence on King Street in January of 1859, carrying a small trunk and a letter of introduction from Cornelius Whitfield. The household employed 6 enslaved people: a cook, a coachman, 2 housemaids, a laundress, and a yardman. Delia's job was to serve as Mrs. Haversham's personal maid, helping her dress, arranging her hair, attending her during social calls, and managing her wardrobe. Mrs. Eleanor Haversham was 43 years old, childless, and devoted to the Episcopal Church and the Ladies' Benevolent Society. She rose at 7 each morning, took breakfast in her room, spent the middle hours visiting other ladies or receiving them in her parlor, and retired early with a novel and a cup of chamomile tea. She was not cruel, exactly, but she was utterly indifferent to the interior lives of the people who served her. Delia learned the household's rhythms within 2 weeks. She learned that the cook, a woman named Bess, had a husband who lived on a plantation near Goose Creek, and whom she was permitted to visit twice a year. She learned that the coachman, Jacob, had a brother who'd been sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama, and whom he hadn't seen in 6 years. She learned that the laundress, Chloe, was pregnant, and terrified her owner would sell the child as soon as it was weaned. And she learned that enslaved people in Charleston talked to each other, not openly, and not in ways their owners noticed. But information flowed through the city's black community like water through a rice field irrigation system. At the market, where domestics haggled for vegetables while passing news in low voices. At the docks, where men loading ships exchanged information about which vessels were taking people south to the cotton frontier. in church basements after Sunday services, where literate freemen read newspapers aloud and discussed which politicians were talking about abolition. Delia had been taught to read by the Whitfield children's tutor, though Cornelius didn't know it. She could write in a careful, schoolgirl hand, and she could forge a simple pass well enough to fool a casual inspection. Within 3 months of arriving at the Haversham household, she was carrying folded scraps of paper in her apron pockets, delivering messages between families who'd been separated by sale. A note from Bess to her husband in Goose Creek. I am well. Mrs. H says we will summer in Charleston this year, so I cannot visit. Tell your overseer you need medicine from the city. I will ask Mrs. H to have me fetch it. A note from Jacob to a freedman who knew someone who might have news of Jacob's brother. Ask about Josiah, sold through Oakes and Company in 1853, said to be working cotton in the Selma region. Small things, fragile connections, but to people who'd been told they had no right to family, no right to know where their loved ones had gone, no right even to mourn. These scraps of paper were everything. Delia delivered the notes during errands. Mrs. Haversham sent her to shops, to the homes of other society ladies, to church for prayer meetings. No one questioned a well-dressed maid walking through Charleston with a basket over her arm. And if Delia happened to pause at the market to speak with Bess's husband's cousin, or to slip a folded note under a specific loose brick behind St. Philip's Church, who would notice? Dinah's circuit was different. She was hired to Colonel Arthur Marchant, who owned 2 plantations in Beaufort County and a townhouse in Beaufort proper. Marchant was a militia officer, a rice planter, and a man who traveled constantly between his properties and the political center of Charleston. Dinah's job was to attend to his wife and 3 daughters when the family was in Beaufort, and to accompany them when they traveled. Beaufort County was rice country. The plantations along the rivers produced millions of pounds of the grain every year, worked by thousands of enslaved people who labored in the flooded fields under conditions that killed them with brutal efficiency. Malaria, dysentery, accidents with the heavy wooden floodgates, heat exhaustion. The mortality rate on rice plantations was higher than almost anywhere else in the South. Dinah saw it all. She accompanied Mrs. Marchant on visits to neighboring plantations, where the mistresses would sit in parlors sipping tea while enslaved women fanned them and brought cakes. Dinah stood behind Mrs. Marchant's chair, silent and watchful, while the white women discussed which families were buying more land, which were selling off people to cover debts, which young men had been killed in hunting accidents, or which daughters had married well. And while she stood there, Dinah listened to the other enslaved people in the room. The woman refilling the water pitcher, the girl standing by the door with a fan, the cook bringing in fresh pastries. A glance, a gesture, a quietly murmured sentence when the mistresses weren't paying attention. Mistress says we're moving to the Charleston house next month. Do you know if they're hiring on King Street? My brother was sold to a Columbia trader. Have you heard of anyone taken north recently? There's a man preaching at the River Church on Sundays. Says things about freedom. You heard of him? Dinah collected the information like a thresher collecting rice. Names, dates, locations, prices, which traders were moving through the region, which plantations were expanding, which were failing, which overseers were brutal, which were merely indifferent. And once a month, when she accompanied the Marchant family back to Charleston for social engagements, she found ways to pass that information to Delia. Sometimes they met in person, briefly, at the market or during overlapping errands. More often, they left notes in dead drops, behind a loose brick, under a specific pew in a church, in a hollow fence post near the docks. The notes were short, coded in simple substitutions that would look like shopping lists or prayer reminders to anyone who found them. Aunt Ruth asks after Joseph, heard he was taken to Colombia in February. Translation: a man named Joseph was sold to a Colombia trader in February, and his family in Beaufort wants to know where he ended up. Cotton prices rising. Uncle suggests selling livestock. Translation: a plantation is selling off people to pay debts, small fragments of intelligence scattered across dozens of families and hundreds of miles. But together, they formed a map. Delphine's territory was the rural parishes. She was hired to Reverend Thomas Caldwell, an Episcopal minister who served a circuit of plantation chapels in the interior counties, Berkeley, Orangeburg, Dorchester. Caldwell was unmarried, 47 years old, and devoted to his work, which consisted of preaching to enslaved congregations on Sundays, baptizing infants, performing marriages, and consoling the dying. Delphine traveled with him as his servant, cooking his meals, washing his clothes, and managing the small parsonages and guest rooms where he stayed during his circuit. The work was exhausting. Caldwell covered 70 or 80 miles each month, moving from plantation to plantation, and Delphine had to pack and unpack his books, prepare his vestments, and ensure he was fed and presentable for each service. But the work gave her access. Caldwell preached to congregations of 50, 100, sometimes 200 enslaved people gathered in plantation chapels or outdoor brush arbors. He spoke about patience, obedience, and the promise of heaven for those who bore their earthly suffering with Christian fortitude. Most of the white plantation owners approved, believing that Christianity made enslaved people more docile. What they didn't see was what happened after the service. Caldwell would retire to the parsonage to rest and read, and Delphine would be left in the kitchen or yard with the people who'd attended the service. Women would approach her, asking if she'd seen their sisters or cousins who'd been sold to other properties. Men would ask if she'd heard news from Charleston about whether war was coming, whether the government would really try to end slavery, whether there was any hope of freedom. Delphine listened. She remembered, and she wrote it down. Caldwell didn't know she could write. He assumed, like most white Southerners, that enslaved people were illiterate unless proven otherwise. So Delphine kept a small notebook hidden in the lining of her travel bag, and she recorded names, relationships, and locations in a cramped hand that made the entries look like household inventories. Sarah Middleton, sold to Colleton County, wants word sent to Mother Esther at Magnolia Plantation. Isaiah Brooks, hired out to phosphate mine near Ashley River. Wife Hannah expecting child in July. Hannah expects to be sold after child is born. Wants Isaiah to know where she's taken. Once every 2 months, Delphine returned to Charleston when Caldwell had business there. She would seek out Delia or Dinah, and they would compare notes. Between the three of them, they were building an invisible ledger of the Low Country's enslaved population. Who was where, who was related to whom, who had been sold, and where they'd gone. It was fragile, incomplete, and utterly dependent on their ability to keep moving without raising suspicion. The system worked for nearly 3 years before Cornelius Whitfield proposed the first substitution. In April of 1862, his niece in Savannah needed temporary help, and he suggested to Randolph Haversham that Delia be loaned out for 6 weeks while Dinah took her place in the Haversham household. Haversham agreed, reluctantly. He was going to be in Columbia on political business, and his wife would barely notice the switch, or so Whitfield assured him. The substitution required careful choreography. Delia and Dinah met in secret the night before the exchange, in a storage shed behind the Whitfield townhouse. They sat facing each other in the darkness, and Delia coached her sister on every detail of the Haversham household. Mrs. Haversham likes her tea at precisely 3 o'clock, and she wants the cup filled only 3/4 full. She'll send you back if it's too full. Her favorite dress is the green silk, but she'll pretend she wants to wear the gray linen first, and you have to convince her that the green is more appropriate. Does she talk to you? About her friends, about who's marrying whom, who's pregnant, who's in debt. You don't have to respond much. Just nod and say, "Yes, ma'am," and "That's a shame, ma'am." Dinah absorbed it all. She was used to mimicking. They all were. As children, they'd learned to copy each other's mannerisms so precisely that their mother couldn't tell them apart by voice or gesture alone. Now they were using that skill for survival. The substitution went flawlessly. Mrs. Haversham noticed nothing, and for 6 weeks, while Delia was in Savannah, Dinah operated on the King Street circuit, delivering the same messages, making the same drops, maintaining the same network. When Delia returned, they met again in the storage shed. Did anyone suspect? No. I kept my head down and my voice soft. Mrs. Haversham barely looks at my face. Delia felt something close to relief. If they could switch places without detection, they could expand their reach. If Dinah could impersonate Delia, then Delphine could impersonate Dinah, and Delia could impersonate Delphine. 3 women could become 9 or 12, covering circuits and networks that would be impossible for any one person to maintain. They began planning their rotations in earnest. Coded notes passed between them more frequently, detailing not just the information they were carrying, but the mannerisms and speech patterns each sister needed to adopt. The hand signals developed organically, a quick count of fingers to indicate which sister was currently where, a coded reminder for anyone in their network who might need to know. 2 fingers for Delia's circuit, 3 for Dinah's, 4 for Delphine's. The system held for another year, and then the war came. Fort Sumter was bombarded on April the 12th, 1861, and South Carolina seceded from the Union with the fervent certainty of a people who believed God, history, and economics were all on their side. The war everyone expected to last a few months ground on through 1862 and into 1863. Charleston became a fortress city, ringed with artillery and swarming with soldiers. The Union Navy blockaded the coast, choking off the cotton exports that had made the city rich. Food grew scarce. Inflation spiraled. Plantation owners started selling off people to raise cash, flooding the market with enslaved laborers they could no longer afford to feed. And in the chaos, a group of Charleston's elite formed the Coastal Relief Association. Officially, the association was a charity to support widows and orphans of Confederate soldiers. In practice, it was a network of planters, merchants, and military officers who were using the war to consolidate power and profit. They bought plantations from bankrupt neighbors, hired out enslaved laborers at inflated rates, and controlled access to the black market goods that trickled through the blockade: coffee, medicine, writing paper, lamp oil. One of the association's founders was Cornelius Whitfield. Another was Randolph Haversham. A third was Colonel Arthur Marchant. The men met monthly in the Charleston Hotel to coordinate their business, and they needed reliable information about conditions across the Low Country: which plantations were failing, which enslaved populations were restive, which families were hoarding supplies. Whitfield proposed using the triplets. The other men were skeptical at first. 3 enslaved women moving between households, substituting for one another. It sounded implausible. But Whitfield demonstrated the system. He brought Delia to one association meeting, then Dinah to the next, and challenged the members to tell them apart. Most couldn't. The association agreed to fund the operation. They formalized the hiring contracts, paying Whitfield a lump sum to keep all 3 women circulating through the Low Country for a full year. And they gave the triplets specific assignments: listening for talk of slave uprisings, monitoring which plantations were selling off prime laborers, reporting any contact with Union sympathizers or abolitionists. Delia, Dinah, and Delphine understood exactly what was happening. They were being weaponized. But they also saw an opportunity. The network the triplets had built over 4 years was fragile, held together by memory and trust. They'd helped dozens of families stay in contact, passed hundreds of messages, and created an informal map of who was where across 3 counties. But the information was scattered, stored in 3 heads and a few hidden notebooks, vulnerable to loss or betrayal. In the spring of 1863, Delia proposed something more permanent. She'd been thinking about the Coastal Relief Association's own methods, the careful ledgers they kept, the coded correspondence they sent between members, the way they documented everything to maintain control and coordination. What if the triplets did the same? The risk was enormous. A written record could be discovered, and discovery would mean death. But without documentation, everything they'd built would vanish the moment they were separated permanently, sold, or killed. Delphine was the one who actually created the ledger. She had access to blank books and writing supplies through Reverend Caldwell's parsonages. She took a small account book, the kind used for tracking household expenses, and began transcribing the information she'd been carrying in her head. Names, relationships, locations, who had been sold where, who was looking for family, who was planning to run. She coded it simply. First names only, with locations indicated by the first letter of the plantation or town. Relationships marked with symbols that could be dismissed as household notations. Dates written in a way that looked like financial entries. Sarah M., C County, seeks Esther M. Plantation. Isaiah B., a river mine, wife Hannah, child due 763. The ledger grew to 30 pages. Delphine kept it hidden in her travel bag, stitched into the lining beneath a false bottom. When she returned to Charleston, she showed it to Delia and Dinah. "This is our memory," Delphine said. "Even if something happens to us, this survives." Delia understood the weight of it. The ledger was evidence of resistance, of unauthorized literacy, of a conspiracy that crossed property lines and violated every law designed to keep enslaved people isolated and powerless. If it was found, they would be killed. Publicly, as an example. But it was also their only weapon against erasure. They agreed to maintain the ledger together, with each sister adding entries as they moved through their circuits. And they agreed that if the war ended, if freedom came, if they survived, they would use the ledger to reunite as many families as they could. In July of 1863, the Coastal Relief Association decided to document its operations. They commissioned a photographer to take portraits of key assets, the warehouses where they stored black market goods, the ships they used to run the blockade, and the triplets who were gathering intelligence across the region. Whitfield was instructed to bring all 3 women to Charleston for 1 week in August. The association wanted proof of their similarity, something they could show to potential clients who might want to hire the triplets for similar work elsewhere. Delia, Dinah, and Delphine arrived at the Whitfield townhouse on August 10th, 1863. It was the first time they'd been together in 9 months. They embraced in the kitchen, quickly and without speaking, then went about the work of appearing unremarkable to the household staff who were watching them. But that night, after the rest of the household was asleep, They met in the room where they'd been assigned to stay. Delphine pulled the ledger from her bag and spread it open on the narrow bed. They had 1 week. 1 week to consolidate everything they'd learned, to update the entries, to plan for what came next. "The war is turning," Delia said quietly. "The association thinks the Confederacy is winning, but the Union is strangling the coast. Soldiers are deserting. People are starving. It's going to collapse." "And when it does?" Dinah asked. "When it does, we run." They spent 4 nights filling in the ledger. Names of families who'd been separated, plantations that were failing, routes that runaways had used successfully, and a new section, a list of people in their network who could be trusted if freedom came, and they tried to help families reconnect. The photograph was commissioned for August 18th. A photographer named Marcus Delane had a studio on King Street, and he was known for his formal portraits of Charleston's elite. The association paid him $50 to photograph the triplets, a sum that reflected both the quality they expected and the secrecy they required. Delane arranged the composition carefully. 3 women standing shoulder to shoulder, dressed in matching gray dresses with white collars, a mahogany chair to the right for visual balance, a painted backdrop suggesting a genteel parlor. He posed them with their hands clasped at their waists, a conventional arrangement for formal portraits. But just before Delane triggered the shutter, Delia adjusted her grip. 2 fingers extended against her wrist. Beside her, Dinah did the same. 3 fingers. Then Delphine. 4. Delane noticed nothing. The exposure took 8 seconds, and the triplets held perfectly still, their faces serene and identical, their hands counting out the circuits they controlled. The photograph was developed and mounted, and Whitfield wrote on the back, "The triplet maids, together 1 week only." 1 week, because the association's work required them separated, scattered, invisible, but the photograph remained, evidence hidden in plain sight. The Union Army captured Morris Island in July of 1863. By September, Union artillery was shelling Charleston from batteries on the island, and the city's elite began evacuating to inland plantations. The Coastal Relief Association continued its work, but the network was fraying. Roads were damaged, communications were disrupted, and the enslaved population was watching the federal forces with a hope that terrified their owners. In November, Whitfield received an urgent message from the association: consolidate assets and prepare to move operations to Columbia. That included the triplets. Delia, Dinah, and Delphine were ordered back to Charleston. They arrived within 2 days of each other, and Whitfield informed them they would be traveling inland with him within the week. They had no intention of going. The 3 women met one final time in the Whitfield kitchen, in the dark hour before dawn. Delphine had the ledger. Delia had forged passes, 3 documents she'd been preparing for months, identifying them as free women of color traveling to visit family in Columbia. Dinah had stolen money, $23 taken in small amounts from households where she'd worked over the years. "We leave separately," Delia said. "Different routes, different days. If one of us is caught, the others keep going." "Where do we meet?" "Philadelphia, the Mother Bethel Church on 6th Street. There's a community of freedmen there who help runaways. We go north, we find each other, and we use the ledger to help everyone else we can." They divided the contents of the ledger, each memorizing 1/3 of the entries in case the physical book was lost. Then they burned the original pages, one by one, in the kitchen hearth, reducing 4 years of work to ash. But they kept the photograph. Delia had taken it from Whitfield's study and she folded it carefully into the lining of her bag. Evidence, proof, a record of what they had been and what they had done. Dinah left first, on November 27th, slipping out of the household before dawn and making her way to the docks, where she bribed a dock worker to hide her on a ship heading north with contraband cotton. Delphine left 2 days later, traveling by land through the interior, using her knowledge of the rural parishes to avoid checkpoints. Delia waited until December 3rd, the night of a Confederate artillery barrage that kept the household distracted. She walked out the front door of the Whitfield townhouse carrying nothing but a small bag and the forged pass in her pocket. By the time Cornelius Whitfield realized all 3 women were gone, they were already beyond his reach. Dinah arrived in Philadelphia on January 9th, 1864, half frozen and sick with fever. She'd spent 6 weeks hiding in the hold of a merchant ship, then walking the final 30 miles through snow when the ship docked in Wilmington. A Quaker family found her collapsed on the road and brought her to the Mother Bethel Church, where the minister, a freedman named Reverend Daniel Payne, took her in without asking questions. She recovered slowly. The fever had settled in her lungs, and she spent 3 weeks in bed, coughing and shivering while Reverend Payne's wife brought her soup and tea and sat with her through the worst nights. When she was strong enough to speak, Dinah asked if anyone had heard of 2 other women, Delia and Delphine, who might be looking for family in the city. The answer was no. Dinah waited. Weeks turned into months. She took work as a seamstress in a workshop run by free black women, saving every penny she earned. She attended church every Sunday and scanned the congregation for faces that might be her sisters. She listened for news from the South, the fall of Charleston in February 1865, the Confederate surrender at Appomattox in April, the passage of the 13th Amendment in December. Freedom came, but her sisters did not. In the spring of 1866, a woman arrived at Mother Bethel Church, asking for Dinah by name. She was rail thin, her hair cropped short, her hands scarred from frostbite. But Dinah recognized her immediately. Delphine. They held each other in the church vestibule and wept. Delphine had spent a year working her way north through the interior, moving from one freedman's settlement to another, always asking after her sisters. She'd lost the photograph somewhere in Virginia, but she'd kept the names and locations memorized. She recited them that night, sitting with Dinah in a rented room on Lombard Street, and together they began writing everything down again. A new ledger, smaller than the original, but still covering hundreds of families across the Low Country. They waited another year for Delia. They placed notices in freedmen's newspapers, asking for information about a woman matching her description. They wrote letters to aid societies in Washington, New York, and Boston. In July of 1867, they received a reply from the Freedmen's Bureau in Charleston. A woman named Delia Whitfield had been living there since the end of the war, working as a teacher in a school for formerly enslaved children. She'd married a freedman named Samuel Rivers in 1866 and had a daughter in the spring of 1867. Delia had never left Charleston. She'd gone to ground during the final months of the war and emerged after the Union occupation, using the knowledge she'd gathered over 8 years to help reunite families across the region. Dinah and Delphine traveled south to find her. The reunion happened on a Sunday afternoon in August, in the small house on Cumming Street, where Delia lived with her husband and infant daughter. The 3 women stood facing each other in the parlor, and for a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Delia smiled. "We need to update the ledger." They spent the next 3 years doing exactly that. The original network they'd built during the war became the foundation for a massive reunification effort across the South. Delia remained in Charleston, coordinating with Freedmen's Bureau agents and aid societies. Dinah returned to Philadelphia and helped establish a registry of families searching for lost relatives. Delphine traveled through the Low Country, visiting plantations and settlements, recording names and stories. Together, they helped reconnect over 400 families between 1867 and 1870. The photograph surfaced again in 1923, when Cornelius Whitfield III, grandson of the original owner, was sorting through family papers before a move to Atlanta. He found it in a trunk of documents from the Civil War era, labeled the Triplet Maids, together 1 week only. He had no idea who they were or why the photograph had been kept. He placed it in a box with other family memorabilia and stored it in his attic. It sat there for 96 years when Maya Chen and Patricia Hale began investigating the triplets' story in 2019. They started with the photograph, but quickly moved to other archives. The South Carolina Historical Society had letters mentioning the Coastal Relief Association. The Freedmen's Bureau records contained references to Delia Rivers's school in Charleston. The Mother Bethel Church in Philadelphia had baptismal records for Dinah and Delphine's children and grandchildren. What they didn't find was the ledger itself. Patricia spent 6 months searching for any physical evidence of the underground registry the triplets had maintained. She found references to it in oral histories, descendants who remembered grandparents talking about the book the triplet ladies kept. But no one had seen the actual document in living memory, until she visited the great-grandson of Delia and Samuel Rivers. His name was Marcus Rivers, and he lived in Mount Pleasant in a small house filled with photographs and family papers. Patricia and Maya visited him on a Saturday afternoon in October 2019 and explained what they'd discovered about his great-grandmother. Marcus listened quietly. Then he stood and walked to a bookshelf in the corner of his living room. He pulled down a worn leather portfolio and brought it back to the table. "My grandmother gave this to me before she died," he said. "Told me to keep it safe and to only show it to people who understood what it meant." Inside the portfolio was a small account book, its pages covered in cramped handwriting. Names, locations, relationships. Hundreds of entries spanning the years 1863 through 1870. The ledger. Patricia opened it with trembling hands. On the first page, in careful script, someone had written, "For memory, for family, for the day when we are all free to find each other." Maya took photographs of every page. Patricia documented the entries, cross-referencing them with other archives, confirming names and relationships that had been lost to official history. And Marcus Rivers agreed to donate the ledger to the Low Country Heritage Museum, with one condition: that any descendants who wanted to see it could access it freely, without charge, without bureaucratic barriers. The ledger is there now, in a climate-controlled case in the museum's permanent collection. Beside it is the photograph. 3 identical women with steady gazes and hands that count 2, 3, 4. Thousands of people visit each year. Some are researchers, some are tourists, and some are descendants, people whose great-great-great-grandparents appear in the ledger's pages, searching for connections that Delia, Dinah, and Delphine worked a lifetime to preserve. The triplets themselves lived long lives. Delia died in Charleston in 1906, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd grown up hearing stories about the war years. Dinah died in Philadelphia in 1911, active until the end in the Chattahoochee City's abolition memorial societies. Delphine died in 1914 in a small house in Beaufort, where she'd returned after decades in the North, wanting to see the rice fields one more time. None of them left written memoirs. None of them sought public recognition. They'd spent their most dangerous years being invisible, and they carried that habit into freedom. But the ledger survived, and the photograph, and the story passed down through generations who understood that history isn't just what's written in official documents. It's also what's carried in memory, coded in gestures, hidden in plain sight. The museum still gets letters from descendants. Someone will write to say they found their great-grandfather's name in the ledger, or that a family story about the triplet ladies who knew everything turned out to be true. The connections keep forming, threads stretching across a century and a half, weaving together families that slavery tried to tear apart. In Charleston, on the corner of Meeting Street where the Whitfield townhouse once stood, there's a historical marker now. It mentions the site's connection to the Civil War and Reconstruction. It doesn't mention the triplets, but people in the neighborhood know. They tell the story to their children about the three women who looked alike and used it to build a network, who turned their owner's plan against itself, who remembered when remembering was resistance. On quiet nights, when the humidity hangs thick over the low country and the past feels closer than it should, locals say you can still see them. Three women standing shoulder to shoulder, hands counting roots on an invisible map, making sure no one is forgotten. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.